And now, to continue with the agenda of today, we have the financing panel and technical expertise at the service of foundational learning promotion policies. And here we will be discussing about sustainable financing strategies that are inclusive for all these initiatives that we're proposing. And for this panel, I'd like to invite Marco Mantovanelli, the Regional Director for Asia, the Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean for GPE. I can say that again if you need me to. Uh, an applause for Marco, please. Gregory Elacqua, the main economist of the Division of Education in the social sector of the Inter-American Development Bank. Tricia Wind, the program lead for GPE KIX from IDRC Canada. And Ana Lucía Morales Sierra, specialist in education from UNICEF, Guatemala. And for this panel, the moderator will be Javier Gonzalez, director of SUMA. Very well. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to all of you who are joining us today. We can see international organizations that are working in different topics and who have been supporting the region, not only with resources, but also with knowledge, right? So therefore, what we'd like to do is to create this honest and open space where, in addition to our Declaration of Antigua, to mobilize us to action, but there's no action without resources. So we understand that not all are providers of resources in the sense that we have a development bank, UNICEF from the United Nations, and which has a different approach. So it's not loans GPE, which has different types of grants, or a support mechanism in IDRC, which focus is in generating innovation and knowledge. So I'd like to ask each one of you to feel free on how to approach the questions in a way that, according to the pertinence of each institution. So the first one, and this is a very open question, which has to do with financing priorities. And therefore, it'll be more focused on Greg, UNICEF, GPE, and IDRC in regards to priorities regarding knowledge. So somehow we'd like to figure out which priorities have been developed or you have in your portfolios for your countries. What innovative mechanisms are you promoting? And I'll give you an example. Catch a support with the mechanism. I believe this is a mechanism that's great because countries are always commenting how important it is for this topics, and somehow would like to talk about that, and we'd like for all countries to learn what these institutions that support us are doing, but also how to articulate that. So I'd like to make this conversation be very informal, and for all of you to feel free. So I don't know if there's a microphone that we're going to pass around. Okay, so who'd like to start? Don't be shy, please. You came from far away, so Greg, maybe, since you just arrived yesterday, we're going to put you on the spot. We know that you made personal efforts to be here, so thank you, Javier, and thank you all for inviting us. It's a true pleasure and honor to be here with all of you. First of all, I'd like to say that, and I'd like to focus on the foundational learning, which is a topic that I don't directly work on. I don't do research, but the education division is an axis and a main axis in our educational agenda because it is the foundation for the latter educational development and are fundamental for equity in the region. So I'll talk about three financing priorities in this axis. First one, reading based on evidence. And I don't know if you're aware, but we have a star product called Let's All Learn How to Read. And this has been a program that has gotten many awards. And it has reached over 1.2 million students in the region and 62,000 professors. And the outcomes of these programs, this has been a very rigorously evaluated program with publications in academic magazines, and that has achieved a 0.39 standard deviation in regards to magnitude. That's very significant, and with effects that persist up to third grade, starting with pre-primary up to third grade. And this program is focused on 5 foundational skills according to reading sciences: phonological awareness, phonetic fluidity, flowness, vocabulary, and comprehension. Now, a second priority is STEM, math, science. We use the methodology, pedagogy based on research and problem solving, IPP. And this is very interesting. We've done several experiments. I think it's about 10 experiments, ICTs, in the field, which is very important because that does generate causal evidence that is required to finance these programs with results of almost zero point 0.2 standard deviations in mathematics and 0.16 in science. And this is a very robust evidence. The characteristic here combines collaborative exploration with explicit instruction. And a third priority that I'd like to mention, and I believe is very important, thinking of the context of Guatemala with the indigenous student population, which is bilingual intercultural education. We also have a program, I don't know if you know about it, but it's called Jadenka, and it has also won awards. I haven't participated in any of those programs, so I can honor my colleagues, Emma Horacio, who are now at the World Bank, and they work directly in these programs. And Anasam has led these programs, and these shows impressive outcomes on pre-primary education, improvements between 0.2 and 0.18 standard deviation in math, 0.23 in ethnomathematics and intercultural ethnicity, and very important improvements in intercultural knowledge. And I believe that these are very interesting programs thinking of our context. And if you allow me, Javier, I'd also like to mention some of the innovative financing modalities that we've been working on. First, there's tutoring, a remote tutoring program. I haven't worked on that. My colleague, Pablo Soido, was more involved in that as well as other colleagues. But I'd like to mention some of the programs I've worked on in a couple of minutes. People are starting to wonder where you work in. So the first one, well, it has a very low cost between $30 and $60 per student, and they've accomplished very impressive outcomes. I've also evaluated with RCTs from 0.2 standard deviation with specific students with low abilities, and the study or the research covers 7 countries, and it shows very important outcomes in regards to preventing dropouts. And we're starting to incorporate AI to escalate these programs. And I'll go into more depth into that in a little bit, because we're working to scale programs that are high cost programs that require specialized human capital. in order to reach more people, programs in Peru and Chile. Now, second, the financing based on outcomes. And I know my time is coming up, but in Argentina, which is very interesting, we're financing, the idea is to condition financing to improved literacy. And that's a very interesting program that aligns incentives with outcomes. Digital platforms, you probably all know the SEBA model, which is a very successful example. And I'd like to end with two comments here. First one, and Javier mentioned during his presentation yesterday about efficiency, equity, transparency with costs. And I'd like to mention that we have an important agenda in what we call intelligent or smart spending. And we're going to launch a book in September in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese, where we will map in or we mapped in 22 countries in the region, Caribbean, South America, and Central America, with many interviews on how countries, what are the policies and programs that countries use to mobilize more resources, to distribute resources, to implement them, and to monitor in order to achieve more transparency, equity, and efficiency in the adequation of outcomes, to have the resources necessary to achieve the outcomes expected. And I'd like to leave you with 3 critical challenges. First, and Javier, just to emphasize that Javier, well, my second comment will be brief, I promise, but Javier mentioned yesterday, and I think that's very important, that we need to be able to mobilize more resources throughout the region. We're below what the 4% standard recommends. We're below 4%. We increased in the previous decade and then we decreased again. I'd like to remind you that in countries like Costa Rica and Chile that spend a lot more per student than compared to other countries, it's still below others in other countries, because other countries spend between 10 to 20% to what the OECD spends. And then second, the countries, the way they elaborate their budgets, and ministries of education to be able to negotiate with ministries of finance. That's something we also find in that book, and that's something very weak. Many times they use historic criteria with a lot of political pressure from syndicates, but there's a low capacity, technical capacity, to be able to show the return on investment before the ministries of the interior. And something that we learned in the book that's very important, because in education we are competing with public security, with health, with other priorities that also demanding more funds. And what we found is that in education we have a low ability to negotiate, and that's very important. And finally, I'd like to end that saying that that scaling is key. We do a lot of pilots, but scaling those pilots is fundamental. And many times there's a lack of technical capacity in rural areas, in the provinces, to be able to scale those programs. And I think that scaling is a very important challenge. Thank you very much. Ana Lucia, because of equity, not of gender only, but also language, Greg and Lucia speak in Spanish, and then you can speak in English. And then both groups receive an interpreter support. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the honor of being able to participate in this panel. And after the declaration, this space, as Guatemala and UNICEF, we are honored and pleased to be able to ratify the commitment on foundational learning and early childhood. As you know, UNICEF is an organization that's always surveilling for the well-being of childhood in all dimensions, and education is not behind. And I believe that this last declarations, this last presentations, this past 2 days confirm that in Guatemala we do have a lot of progress, but there's challenges to close gaps in terms of access, quality, and coverage in education. And obviously at UNICEF Guatemala, in our educational portfolio, we have several priorities, but I'd like to focus specifically on two, which are the ones that I'm going to mention, which is foundational learning and initial education. In initial education, I have the honor to share the scenario with my former colleagues of the Ministry of Education. I was also part of their team, but I'd like to comment that at UNICEF, we're investing our own resources as well as mobilizing other resources from other companies, foundations, and other international organizations in order to support the ministry, not only to expand and extend initial education coverage, but also to improve services and delivery, focusing on quality. Recently, we had the opportunity to receive funds, which we call catalyzer funds, and these funds are assigned for holistic programs and through different services, health, protection, and education. We're able to make holistic interventions, but at the same time, we get the opportunity to pilot programs and implement specific actions in early childhood. And that's also linked to the opportunity of investing in some specific technical assistant actions for the Ministry of Education. And with conversations with the Higade team, we've been able to establish certain priorities. And among them, the ministry has commented that they'd like to review the delivery model, the method, and modalities. So right now we have a very important component of an initial education with a community model, but we'd like to expand that model to include other delivery modalities. And as UNICEF, we're pleased to be able to invest with our own funds as well as with other funds from other organizations channeled through us, as well as with GPE funds. So we are a managing entity, so we'll be able to certify professionals who will be assisting early childhood. And we believe that this is a basic element and a fundamental one to ensure the quality in the delivery of services. So this is the bridge with reading and math learnings. And as my colleague Agustin mentioned, investing in early childhood and initial education is a way to go from remedial model to a prevention model, because we know that we're setting the foundation, solid foundation for learning of students in order to avoid having them get to sixth grade and remediate what didn't take place in initial education. So that leads me to my second point, which is that through the execution of multiplying subvention that we received through GPE, we've had the opportunities to support in some strategic lines, among which is the implementation of the learning leveling strategy designed by the Ministry of Education together with other international organizations. And that is something that makes us very proud to know that we're taking actions in the classroom based on scientific evidence, and our colleagues from the ministry have proven that this has been implemented. We have real-time data of how students are being evaluated and how we'll be able to see that improvement in reading. So we have knowledge that this will be replicated for mathematics, and eventually this will become an opportunity to scale learning leveling, not only in elementary, but in other levels. So I'd like to reiterate the support from UNICEF. And when we get to knock on the doors of other donors, we'll have that as a priority, because we're very proud to know that we have a close relationship with the ministry to identify priorities, because when we're looking for financing, especially with this new scenario and reality where there's an important reduction of funds, we need to be creative, we need to multiply our efforts, and we need to seek solutions with other companies, other or non-traditional organizations that we hadn't targeted before. So in that sense, that's a perspective of UNICEF Guatemala and how we can seek those holistic interventions, but with a focus on initial education and in reading learnings. Thank you, Ana Lucia. And I'd like to go back to a couple of topics that you touched upon. But Marco, I'd like to ask you, obviously from the key role of GPE, how do you see the mobilization, local mobilization with the private sector, but also the public sector? All what we were talking about GPE, with tax topics, those are very complex, but there's also spaces like this one, which are reflection space. What's important that you see in this topic where GPE is raising awareness in the different countries in regards to the tax topic.
Thank you very much. And Javier, let me also thank you now, because I'm leaving in the afternoon, and your entire team, SUMA, for this event, and OECS and CRD for the partnership that allows KIX to be so effective as we have seen it in these days. Look, let me just rewind a bit on GPE and what we are looking forward in terms of areas of investments, and I get to your specific issues. Well, we do have a strategic framework, of course, in GPE, but our financing focus is driven by the partnerships on the ground. We are a partnership and a fund, and we prize ourselves on not going there with the recipe. However, it's clear the foundational learning is at the center about both our strategic framework and what we are getting from the countries and from the countries in Latin America. We heard it in these days. I mean, I was thinking what I'm going to tell my son that at the tender age of 25, since he's an engineer and is a bit square, he keep asking, but what do you do at work? You know, and so I was thinking, well, what I'm coming back to him with this, and you know, it's clear, we know what's happening. There is a learning crisis. We know also, and we have enough evidence, thanks to the work in this room, of what works, right? What is missing is how we take all this to scale, and how we go through the political economy at country level to make sure that it goes to scale. The financing is part of it, of course. So, going back, we have a demand-driven, to GPE, a demand-driven approach. We have compacts. El Salvador is putting emphasis on foundational learning in their compact. We have grants that we finance under these compacts. Belize is financing technology and teachers training, all in a package to respond to the foundational need of learning gaps and inclusion, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of examples. I will not go through the list. The challenge, as I said, is that we face the gap between policy and action. And I'm very glad to have seen here all the representatives of the government pledging to action, because that is the most difficult part for us. To go to your question, Javier, our model of financing involves some innovative mechanism of financing. So it's not grants in the old style, oh, here's the money, do. We have the multiplier, where we try to raise additional funds. Within the multiplier, there is different versions of it. There are versions where we work with private sector to mobilize their engagement with foundations. So there are different. We'd explore, particularly in Africa, debt swaps, etc. I think we are beginning to think about the questions you're putting on the table. What else on domestic financing? You know that our analysis of enabling factors that underpins the compact includes, among the 4 enabling factors for transformative and systemic reforms, domestic financing. And its volumes, its efficiency, and its equity of domestic financing. But we realize, given the learning crisis and given everything that is going on the international environment, then we need to be more creative. So looking forward, we're looking forward to expanding partnerships with non-sovereign donors. We have just announced the creation of a GPE foundation that is specifically geared to mobilize and help us reach out more systemically to private sector and foundations, rich individuals, whatever you want in the sphere. But then there is the mechanisms. And so we have created a line, a technical line in GP that's thinking about innovative financing. I'm going back on Monday to chair a panel with the IMF. I mean, you don't think about the IMF as the first engagement on domestic financing for education, but going back to what my IDB colleague said, we need to learn to talk to the Ministry of Finance. So we are trying to learn from the IMF how to talk to the Ministry of Finance about education. And as part of that agenda, I suspect that there will be an evolution of thinking also in the direction of more progressive fiscal reforms or VAT earmarked taxes that could go to educations. You know, there are examples around the world of these things. Going back to evidence, we need to fill the gap of evidence on when they work and under what circumstances. So I think the status is there. Innovation, both on the basis of the programs that work, but the challenge is how to scale them up. And on the financing side, we need all to move out the old paradigm of public budgets and ODAs, overseas development assistance, and think more creatively, because otherwise we're missing a big train.
Thank you so much, Marco. Very interesting. I think you sharing the issue of the foundation in Switzerland, the new one that will allow individuals, philanthropists, to contribute more directly well, I guess also to the replenishment process. I guess in Latin America and the Caribbean, I was showing yesterday the high levels of inequality that we have. And of course, that's something that we have to fix. But on the other hand, it could be also an opportunity, why not, of reaching out to those fortunes, to those individuals. In terms of transactional cost, is quite lower, because basically we know that in each country there are unfortunately only 5-6 families that probably have that, are part of that 1%. And some of them are genuinely trying to engage into real philanthropy, not only charity, but really trying to change something. So I guess it's a very good news, Marco. Thank you so much for sharing that. Trish, I know that, of course, IDRC does not provide funds as other funders. So maybe just to tweak a little bit, the question would be more, maybe what would you say the IDRC's priority in terms of knowledge generation? So please.
Yeah, thanks. So certainly within GPE KIX, the questions on inclusive early learning are a very common priority across all the regions, so Latin America and the Caribbean, but also across Africa and Europe, Middle East, Asia Pacific. And so this has been a really big focus of both inter-country knowledge exchange, like through regional hubs, but also through the applied research that we get to fund. And I could say, in terms of the priorities within that research, I just want to say that knowledge mobilization, like actually using what we already know, for us is as important as generating new knowledge. And while generating new knowledge, you want to make sure that it gets used. So building knowledge mobilization into evidence generation processes for us is a top priority. And it's interesting that we've heard already a number of times about scaling and going beyond pilots. There's a lot of really important evidence generation about what works and about what's cost effective. And there's often an implicit assumption that once we know that, then we are off to the races and it can scale and we're good. But frankly, most things fall apart when you go from a pilot to a large-scale implementation. So we decided that within GPE KIX, that maybe the contribution that we could make to the broad range of evidence for education is research for and about scaling. So taking things that we know are already working, either promising or proven, and then placing the research questions around, well, what further adaptations have to happen so that it can scale? How do we simplify it? How do we make it more cost effective? And how does it need to adapt to new contexts, or perhaps to really take on the issues of equity and inclusion, because sometimes pilots are done in the places where it's kind of easy to do the program, but really the focus on scaling is how do you get to the areas that are much more marginal, much harder to reach. So if I'm thinking about our topics and our priorities for knowledge mobilization and research, it's that. Just on the topics of financing, I think we also know that in many places, 80 to 90% of the education budget is spoken for before you even start the year because it's on teacher salaries or it's on foundation or returning costs. So anything that we want to add in terms of innovation needs to be extremely cost effective. And they need to be very grounded and that will work in local contexts. One of the things that has been developed through some GPE financed work, even before KIX started, and things that we've been able to support, is actually a really helpful toolkit developed by UNICEF called the Early Childhood Accelerator. And there is a full suite of tools to support subsector planning. What I like about this project is not only did UNICEF use evidence to build this tool, but they've been really working with a number of countries to use it and then adapting the tool based on those countries' experience. And anytime they talk about it, they bring somebody from Sierra Leone, they bring somebody from Lesotho, from Tajikistan, from Kyrgyzstan, who've been using this and can share with their peers about how did they use this toolkit. Because frankly, we have too many toolkits that are out there that are in fact beautiful and are comprehensive, but in fact they don't get used enough. So we want, again, to focus on this knowledge mobilization and the use of evidence. So one of the new pieces of this toolkit that was developed in the last couple of years through GPE KIX was a new interactive costing tool that helps countries really plan out all the costs that would be associated with expansions of quality early learning. Everything about infrastructure, the human and financial resources needed to meet all the targets that are being set. And then it also has a whole guideline on inclusive financing and innovative financing. So if you want to kind of see through, imagine what are the block grant possibilities, my results-based financing, all the different private partnership type things that you could think through, they're all listed there so that at least you could imagine then what would be most useful for my country. I'm going to say just one tiny piece about maybe it's a very small thing, but the part where we try to be a little bit innovative in our financing too in GPE KIX is that sometimes you have the logic of a research project or a research initiative that has its full, thoughtful plan for a 3-year implementation. But actually, once the research is done, you close the project, you finalize the outputs, and you walk away. And that's not what we want. So we're trying to include very small extra bits of financing to help meet demand for the use of that evidence. And so within the hubs, there's a country support initiative that allows the hub to identify places where maybe an extra bit of knowledge mobilization, maybe some targeted knowledge generation or capacity strengthening to use what we know is a really helpful intervention for a very particular policy moment. And then when we have mature research that we've been able to fund through GPE KIX, we also have a furthering impact fund where if somebody says, actually, this Ministry of Education asked us to do that little bit extra to help them really use what we've been working on, then they can get an extra little bit to make that happen.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. Sorry?
Could I do a small follow-up?
Yeah, please do.
Muy bien. Sí, debido a que Tricia mencionó los kits de herramientas, quería enfatizar en un documento que creo que Agustín lo mencionó ayer. Y es muy bueno porque fue publicado por el Banco Mundial en alianza con el panel de asesoría global y se conoce como son formas efectivas de financiar el aprendizaje. Se los recomiendo porque es muy costo efectivo el enviar un correo electrónico a los padres de familia, a los estudiantes y actores clave con regularidad sobre el valor de la educación. Muy costo efectivo. Y luego tecnología. Entonces yo sí les sugiero que lo revisen. Es un excelente kit de herramientas. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Marco. So basically what I'd like to do, taking your intervention and moving to cost effectiveness, eh, so we welcome what you were just saying, Marco. And I'd like to ask, what are the things, and I think that Greg, you also mentioned this about efficiency, but combining what we've discussed, we talked about efficiency and the challenges with scaling, and therefore, from the Inter-American Development Bank with an important trajectory in the region, what are the challenging conditions that are seen necessary for that scaling, and what are the most cost effective? And in your case, talk about enabling conditions. What are the barriers in public policy, working with the ministry? What would you say is the real challenge of what Trish mentioned? We're going from the pilot to scaling, and not only a pilot by 1,000, because that doesn't work. That's what I personally think, but how that pilot can be transformed into a public policy in this sense of scaling. How can it be incorporated? How can it be nested? Yes. Okay, so we've already talked about some evidence-based programs with cost effectiveness in foundational learning, but we've identified 4 fundamental pillars as enabling conditions. But I'd like to emphasize in 2 things. In terms of pilots, it's still important to continue doing some pilots. I do agree with you that we do have an important evidence-based foundation, but there's still a lot more to learn. So I believe that this is important and something that we've learned in Chile. In Chile, we scale everything. And the same thing needs to be done here. We need to pilot before scaling. And that's an important lesson learned that with Chilean reforms. But we've identified 4 pillars. First, inclusive and contextual curriculums. It's important to integrate foundational learning with cross-cutting skills, with the participation of indigenous and African descent communities, and ensure locally relevant content. And second, goes without saying, professors that are supported. They need training on continuous learning, coaching, mentoring, and thinking about strengthening the pipeline of professors from the recruitment, selection, training, and retention. And something that we've been working on, and this is related with scaling of pilots, many of these pilot programs require very specialized human capital. And sometimes that has a high cost. For example, in Chile, and we know that professors, Nobel professors, the first 2 professors abandon the profession after the 2 years because they don't have the support, because sometimes they're assigned to very challenging schools, very vulnerable, remote schools. They do not have the skills to lead the class, and 30% abandon the profession. That's very consistent throughout the region. So the government has an onboarding program that has been very well assessed, but it only reaches a certain percent of professors because it has a high cost. It requires very specialized mentors. And that's something that we've been working on with governments, to use AI to emulate the tutors and at least create hybrid programs where there's a tutor and support, but using AI for that as well. So I think that's a huge opportunity, and we're finding very interesting outcomes in Chile and with the current program that we're scaling in Peru as well. Third, didactic aligned resources, and that's extremely important. And then last, continuous evaluation and monitoring. That's fundamental. not only to implement programs, but also to assess the programs and ensure they work and provide the feedback required. So I do think, and that's to respond to your second question, Javier, we do face three main challenges. The first one, and that's something that we all mentioned, insufficient subnational skills and the lack of robust management systems. Second, and that hasn't been mentioned, but that's particularly important in early childhood, which is intersectoral fragmentation. There's disarticulation among education, health, finances. There are institutional silos that prevent us from finding synergies, and that's related with a mobilization of resources that's competing with resources. When we talk to ministers of finances, we are competing. We sit on the table and we all want more resources, and this prevents us from finding a joint vision end to end. Political turnover in the sector that's very high. There are very constant changes in teams, in ministers, and that generates serious issues and discontinuity of successful programs because priorities change, teams change, and they say that this is related to the minister and with the previous administration. And sometimes this happens with the same government period, and this is something that happens in our region. Thank you, Greg. And I think that it's important to reflect on this turnover, which is part of our political system, but that's where KIX, when anchored on local groups, with the academic sector, syndicates, NGOs, this facilitates some commitments, like the one like the Declaration of Antigua, to sustain throughout time. But I believe that the average is 18 months per minister, which is very low. Very well, thank you. I think that I agree with Greg. In Guatemala, two very important points. And I think that to ensure cost-effective interventions that are already dictated in policy, I think that's something that's very important. And from UNICEF, we've been trying to do this since 2023, which is to do this cost research and investment in childhood. So realistically, how to implement a project if we don't have a forecast on the investment required to implement this initiative. So I'd like to briefly mention that the Office of UNICEF Guatemala worked on a budget of what would be the public investment required to ensure the universalization of educational services from initial education up to high school in order to ensure that we can meet the 2030 goals. And obviously, these are very ambitious processes, but without that data, we cannot project. And I think that information feeds the elaboration of policies, but also design of projects. And something that has worked really well with the Ministry of Education has been sitting down with our technical teams to see the reality of program implementation, because many times we design programs, but we do not contemplate or consider, like Tricia mentioned, of the implications this will have for a ministry to absorb this implementation. So we've had a very interesting dialogue with lessons learned, things that worked as implementers, but that we are not sustainable for the Ministry of Education, trying to find that balance between which can be designed, which can be funded, and what is sustainable throughout time. But that's also linked with the generation of information, data, that will help decision makers to say this works, this doesn't work, and what the implications would be in regards to time, resources, etc. So we do consider very important to invest in the technical skills of the ministry. In spite of the political dynamic of our countries, we do consider that if we identify a common objective that transcends governments, we can do very interesting things that will allow programs to be sustainable throughout time, of course, with the required adjustments, but to ensure that things that have been done and that work to continue being done where required, so that constant dialogue with the Ministry of Education and with other implementing entities is very relevant. And I believe that here the topic of alliances and dialogue among organizations, implementing partners, and other organizations is very interesting. And I think that technical tables, roundtables, work and help the Ministry of Education and other stakeholders as well. So I do believe that this is a challenge, but also an opportunity as long as there's political will. If we have organizations that support to strengthen what's already there and to improve what can be done, considering cost efficiencies and the funds required. Thank you, and thank you for the detail on costs. I believe that one of the issues we have is that we say, okay, this is $8 per, or costs $8 per student, but what is the breakdown of those $8? Training, infrastructure, is this for the first year, but maybe the first year is 15 and then 8? Those averages lack information or actually hide information because the required support by in the ministries with staff, for instance. And I'd like to make a calling to funds from Inter-American Development Bank and to make an effort to break down the costs, not synthesize them, but with the best buys to know, okay, this lasts 3 years. The first year it will be more expensive. What is the detail in regards to infrastructure, training? And here I see SUMA as a knowledge partner, because sometimes they say, how much does this cost? And to get to that information, well, all of those who do research know how challenging it is. So I think that's a calling to facilitate the work of the ministries to identify how much it costs to do a Sobral. Not a final figure, but what's a breakdown and timeline. Marco?
See, sorry, a couple of things just to add to what has been already said. Yeah, I mean, the challenges, of course, that we face in this the fiscal space, we discuss it, is shrinking, and within the education, since we're talking about foundational education, even within the education budgets, the prioritization is not always there. We all know that tertiary education absorbs a large share of budget. So there is that challenge that makes it hard to work. Now, then there's the implementation side of things where the fragmented funding and the implementation challenge make it so that it's hard to bring it to scale. Some countries have tried to strengthen this from the public financial management perspective. There's been initiative of tracking $1 from all the way to down, and maybe it goes in the direction of what you're saying, you know, how much of that dollar ends up in effective foundational financing, foundational learning financing. That could be an interesting way to shake the system. There is we face, including in GPE, explaining to our donors a weak link between spending and outcomes. Again, to reinforce this, I think we all share the pain in that front. Ministers, donors like us, we need to find a better way to strengthen that link, because otherwise, well, it's going to be increasingly difficult to make a case for financing education and foundational education. The evidence part, we have discussed it extensively. In some countries is readily available, in some countries it's not, and this affects greatly the capacity to move. Since you encourage us to think about some innovations, things that I see down the line, including in GPE, to expanding a bit the pie of financing, include entering the climate financing arena from the education perspective. Education is the most important climate adaptation investment you can do. Punto. With that, where can we go? Can we divert? And I know it's maybe a war among poor, but can we divert some of the massive funding from climate towards education? We are beginning to do this in the Caribbean with an initiative called CESI, I never remember, Climate Smart Education Sustainable Initiative, which should equip countries to talk and implement programs where education is seen as adaptation. And in the Pacific, you are working with another acronym, BRACE, which I again escaped, but it still goes in that direction where we are trying to build an alliance with the Green Fund in diverting some funds to this. So that's an area. Another area, guarantees. There is space to think about attracting investment, including from the private sector with sovereign guarantees. And it's an area that we're exposed. So, final message from me. Yes, there are challenges, but as we have seen, si se puede, right? We heard that is possible. However, we are facing a contingency period on the international scene that is challenging, is more challenging in the past, but it shakes us off of the business as usual. And that's the silver lining. Maybe we can take this pain we are all feeling right now as an opportunity to become more efficient and more effective at what we do in the sphere of financing education.
Thank you so much, Marco. Tricia, please.
So the question was about effective policies and programs and such. So through GPE KIX, we were able to support applied research in 19 different countries about adapting and scaling these promising or proven innovations for inclusive early learning. And there's a synthesis report that there's a QR code that was flashing through the rotating slides the other day. Maybe we'll be able to get it up in the break again. I guess what we saw across these different experiences that were primarily in Africa and Asia is that in many places, policies are there. The problem is implementation. So there's lots of great policies about 100% coverage of early learning, about inclusion, about mother tongue instruction, about learning through play, but so much is actually just not being implemented. So this is where now we need scalable, low-cost, effective, grounded programs. So when it comes to learning through play, and I was really pleased that I heard so much about this in the first panel with the ministers on day one of this meeting, there are so many missing links. If you think about what all needs to be in place for learning through play to be actually implemented with quality in early learning, in some places there is a curriculum, but very little guidance on how to implement the curriculum. Sometimes there are no actual teaching and learning materials. So a lot of the KIX-funded work was able to do research and at the same time develop the curriculum guidelines, really work with locally, culturally relevant learning through play approaches with materials that are locally available and very low cost and maybe actually made by the community so that you are integrating not only the people who are in school but also the surrounding community to be building those materials. Also, that needs to be part of a mindset, and our colleague from UE was really talking about, the mindsets of teachers and of the whole system is actually part of this. And so the mindset around learning through play is also pretty critical because there can be actually resistance or just not really full understanding about what does that actually mean to do learning through play and is it effective? Like there's some still resistance to it among teachers, but also among parents and communities who think this doesn't sound serious, you're just playing. And yet there's so much evidence to show that this engaged, joyful, collaborative, autonomous learning in the learning through play mindset can be very, very effective. When it comes to teaching professional development for learning through play, all the stuff that we've been hearing about from the last couple of days is all the same about effective TPD. But I think the main challenges for the inclusive early learning is that you're often starting at a much lower level of the incoming cadre of people who are going to be the early childhood educators compared to other teachers. And the lack of effective teacher training is even more of a barrier. Equity, inclusion, and gender equality need to start right there because you are starting children's learning journeys in school. And so all of that focus on inclusion, early identification of children with disabilities, that all needs to be part of that. When it comes to proven models, the child-to-child model of using the resources that are there, including the older children, working with the younger children, seems to be a very cost-effective model. And home-based and community-based centers, our colleague from Guatemala was talking about this communitarian approach. And in Uganda especially, there's a lot of work on home and community-based centers with a strong focus on disability and inclusion. And one of my favorite parts of this project was them really grappling with how do we make sure that we're lowering the barriers for children with disabilities to access quality early childhood in very remote communities. And one of the no-cost things that they decided would be very effective was that you put the center in the compound or right next to the compound of the family with a child with a disability. It makes it normal to interact with that family. It makes it much easier for that child to be part of things. It lowers stigma and addresses the barriers to integration. I just thought these are the kinds of things that we need to think about. The one other part that I'll mention is actually one of the key priorities that we saw was not just quality early childhood, but really supporting the transition between early childhood education and primary school, because there's often quite a disjuncture between children's experience of pre-primary and very play-based learning and all of that, and then actually much more formal grade 1. And so there are a number of different approaches that seem to be effective in supporting that transition, including programs like a 10-week pre-primary program that Laos has now decided is so effective for rural areas that they're going to scale it through their education sector plan and get it financed through the GPE System Transformation Grant, because they found that this particular approach of inclusive intensive pre-primary for very rural children showed really strong on-time enrollment into primary school, and that overall the children did much better in learning and literacy and numeracy compared to children who didn't do the program or even kids who had a 9-month formal one. Then two other very practical ways of supporting that transition was students being able to visit from their pre-primary into the primary schools, teachers communicating and visiting each other's classrooms from the pre-primary and the primary levels, and keeping that learning through play going, not just stopping abruptly as soon as you get into grade 1, but frankly, I think we see, right, that engaged learning, hands-on, collaborative, joyful, works in high school math as well as it does in early learning. So I'll stop there.
Gracias.
So the last question. Okay, so we didn't have this topic of the Declaration of Guatemala, and we're a little bit behind with our agenda. The media has arrived because there's... so the challenge is, in 1 minute, can you please answer this question? And this has to do with one of the greatest challenges between the relationship of ministries and international organization, and this is how to articulate priorities, right? So legitimately, a government has the mandate to define their policies, and on the other hand, international organizations are also mandated by countries with their own priorities, and we're talking about turnover. So how to sustain these priorities throughout time. And on one hand, international organizations based on research and evidence, it's not the Inter-American Development Bank, not the World Bank, but research. There's a lot of good things and a lot of improvement opportunities between this relationship between financing international organizations and the ministries. And of course, there's good things, establishing priorities in the long term that sustain throughout time and that provide technical support and resources. But there's also, and we all know this, and this is also evidence-based, and this is that international organizations have their own agendas. They create this noise in regards to not being aligned with the government priorities. And each one comes with their own priorities. And the ministry might say, okay, I need these resources, but what do I do? The A and B program doesn't work. The president said, I need to work on Plan C. So In 1 minute, or maybe I'll give you 90 seconds, what do you think can be improved in this articulation capacity? And in another sense, what could we ask ministries? You can say we need ministries to be quicker in identifying their priorities or not changing their priorities so often. And on the other hand, self criticism and being humble as international organizations. What can we do better to serve our countries? So, so maybe we're working in different contexts and we naturally think that everything works the same in both, but a brief reflection on what can we improve. So let's genuinely ask ourselves, what can we ask ministries and what can we do ourselves? Okay, who wants to start? I'll let any of you go ahead and start.
Well, I can start because the entire business model of GPE is trying to respond to that. How? We approach countries not saying invest in ABCD, but explain to us why you're picking this specific reform as your priority to leverage system transformation, and explain to us how this is affected by enabling factors like financing, data, gender, etc. So that is the basic question we put on the table. I'm not claiming it's a perfect mechanism, but I'm saying the approach is trying to address precisely that issue of bottom-up demand. How to, once the priority is identified, however, we, like everybody else, suffer difficulty in implementation and changes. There are some mechanisms in the business model. Part of the funds are linked to policy or results achievements, so to try to keep it there. There is a way to address a midterm review of all this that allow us to expand a bit like El Salvador did from pre-primary plus primary of the, but it's always based on give us the evidence upon which you're deciding to do that. Not easy, but that's the model. So it's an attempt to go in the direction of what you're saying.
Indeed. Thank you, Marco, very much for that.
So I think I agree with what Marco mentioned. This is a work of the organizations that manage funds to do that incidence, not only with ministries, but also with donors, how we efficiently communicate, how we so some priorities, there's intermediate periods between programmatic periods, but to be able to communicate quickly how these priorities are adapted and how we can make quick and efficient adjustments, and that requires being flexible with the teams that design projects and leave a flexible margin in regards to changes without sacrificing outcomes and committed goals. And of course, this is not possible with all donors, but with those that we can be flexible, we have to make use of those spaces and to adapt and make changes. And with others, that's a little bit more complicated. So maintain that line and to use flexible funds that don't have rigid locks in order to complement some of the responses and to allow us to adapt quicker. At least at UNICEF, that's what we've seen, and the reflection has always been how to improve our communication processes, our advocacy processes, saying this works, this doesn't work, and what the priorities of this government and the results they have with certain interventions. So that's what we've seen lately.
From the perspective of a research funder and maybe thinking through, GPE KIX experience too, where I think what we've been trying to do is to match a research agenda on the stated policies of the people in the National Ministries of Education and the education sector to try to align research and new evidence into what they're saying they would want to use. I think we can go a lot further than where we've gotten to in trying to make more direct links. But the key part of this that I think is so important for sustainability and for relevance and for ongoing connection is that the research is primarily done by national and regional research organizations because they are there for the long haul. They know what kind of research and what questions that they are building on from the past. And they are going to be there for the long haul, which means that even if that project is done its funding, they're still there. And so opportunities for knowledge mobilization or building on that into the next generation of work is much more natural than for funding northern organizations that may only be doing the one spot piece of research and then they go home. So I think those are two pieces. And then the third piece that I wonder how much, I hear some of this is happening, but I think we could do a whole lot more, is involving those national and regional research organizations in the local education group on an ongoing basis and make sure that they are listening to how issues are talked about there so that they can prime their research for that, but that they also get space to share because sometimes those spaces don't think to include those people, and I think actually they'd be a great asset.
And just a compliment, I'll charge you the minute and a half here. You've gone past that. So at the Inter-American Development Bank, we do focus on two strategies. One is mapping evidence and best practices and identify them in the region and share them with the countries. So based on my experience, 10 years at the Inter-American Development Bank, that's been very important. Sometimes they don't know that they don't have the time to learn that. So sharing those best practices in the region and outside the region, but also identifying partners such as SUMA, the Academy, local universities to generate evidence because countries, ministers have a lot of data, but they don't have the time or the teams or the bandwidth to actually analyze that data and provide what Marco mentioned, this evidence to justify reforms. They don't have the bandwidth or the time. So the Inter-American Development Bank and our team's support, we identify partners such as SUMA and others to support with that. So it's a combination between identifying best practices and also making analysis. And we do see a lot of value add there. Thank you.
Just to add that everybody has talked about including various sectors and the research agenda in the dialogue with the authorities. So I would like to put emphasis on the importance of these local education group or education sector groups. When they work, it's always not the case, but when they work, are very effective to support ministers advocating, to provide evidence, bringing in, KIX up into the compact, to support, to push back about changes across administrations. So we need to make those work. It's easy said than done, but they are very powerful when they work.
Muchas gracias, Marco.
Thank you, Marco. And as you mentioned, that's exactly the challenge. When do these work? And the challenge that we all have is how to make these groups be active, functional, participative, and proactive, and propose things. Of course, we need to have critical thinking, but ability to build upon that critical thinking. And in order for local groups to be efficient, they have to have that perspective, a very honest vision, knowing that what's being done might be good or bad, but also how to build upon that. So I'd like to thank the generosity and the humility to speak on behalf of your own institutions and how to serve our countries better. So thank you very much. Thank you to all our participants. for these valuable interventions, which I think invite us to think on ways to innovate in regards to financing, to be creative, to find new donors, new mechanisms, and also to involve new stakeholders in this challenge. So with this panel, we are ending this block, and we will continue with the coffee break. And I'd like to comment that before our lunch, we're going to take a group picture, and if it's not raining, we'll get to do that outside on the parking lot area. So just a reminder, before lunch, we're going to go down for that group picture. And please make sure you're all there to leave that as a memory of our time together with over 100 people from 11 countries. So enjoy the